Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mi Trang Nguyen, and I'm the Senior Program Counsel for Pro Bono Innovation at the Legal Services Corporation. I'm also a board member of the DC Coalition of Domestic Violence, and it's really my pleasure to moderate this second conversation with you at our forum. Before we begin, I want to just note that our conversation is going to address domestic violence, which is an issue that has likely touched many of us, whether through personal experience or through the experience of someone we know or love. If at any point you find the discussion difficult, please feel free to take care of yourself and step away. We also have team members from the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence here to offer support, so step away at the table and they'll be happy to offer resources to you. Domestic violence. This is an issue that affects people across profession, age, neighborhood, income, every pocket of our community and country. And while overall violent crime has gone down in a lot of places, and that's something to celebrate, many advocates and law enforcement officials who you'll hear from today are seeing the opposite trend in their communities. For survivors, the path to safety often means navigating systems that are not always trauma-informed. That means recognizing the mental and psychological toll that domestic violence can take on them as individuals. And it's also not always survivor-centered. That means it's not putting their voice and their agency at the center. And this causes additional harm. And sometimes this can include the legal system. From protective orders to child custody, housing, employment, benefits. Survivors face complex legal needs in an already risky and stressful moment in their lives. Legal services organizations play a critical role in helping survivors understand their rights and options, and they're part of a broader network of support, one which many of you in this audience are a part of, that moves survivors towards safety and stability. I'm excited to be joined in our conversation today with these wonderful individuals, three leaders working on different parts of that ecosystem, that network for survivors, survivor services, legal aid, and law enforcement. Alicia Williamson is the Senior Director of Survivor Services at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Alicia brings such deep perspective and experience across the survivor services field. It's a real privilege to have her here with us today. Before her work at the network, she was the executive director of a domestic violence shelter. And earlier in her career, she worked as a paralegal with the legal services program in Ohio, helping survivors navigate the civil justice system. Tom Fritchie, executive director of Pine Tree Legal Assistance in Maine, one of our nation's leading legal aid programs. Tom has spent his career expanding access to justice in rural communities and has seen firsthand how legal services attorneys support domestic violence survivors through complex legal challenges towards safety and family stability. Chief Michael Pickett is the chief of police for Birmingham, Alabama. Chief Pickett brings the perspective of law enforcement officers who work directly with families and communities affected by domestic violence. And under his leadership, the Birmingham Police Department is working to address domestic violence holistically and as a key partner in the community. Thank you for joining us. Alicia, you just bring so many hats to this table, and you have such deep experience supporting domestic violence survivors through direct services, through policy work. Can you set the stage for us? From a survivor's perspective, what is the most important thing for us to understand when it comes to effectively supporting them?
Every day across the country, survivors of domestic violence is making the most dangerous decision of their lives, and that is the decision to leave. What many people don't realize is that leaving is not just about safety. It requires navigating systems, housing systems, legal systems, and trauma all at the same time. And the systems designed to support survivors are under tremendous strain. We are in the midst of a housing crisis. If survivors don't have financial stability, if they don't have strong credit, if they don't have rental history, safe housing becomes incredibly difficult. Legal barriers is another added layer. Survivors often need support with protection orders, divorce, custody, and even eviction as a direct result of their abuse. When programs that are designed to support survivors are stretched thin, it makes it impossible for survivors to get the help that they need. And we are seeing the consequences of that here in Ohio. 2025 marked the deadliest year for domestic violence fatalities, with 157 lives that was lost. That was a 37% increase from the previous year. I believe in the power of the collective. When systems are working in tandem with each other, for survivors, we can create sustainability for that survivor. For one clear example of that is what we did in Ohio with strangulation. For years, survivors told us that it was one of the most terrifying forms of abuse, yet the system did not fully recognize it. Cases were often treated as minor offenses. And we now know that strangulation is one of the strongest predictors of future homicide. But survivors spoke up, advocates elevated their voices, medical professionals brought the evidence, fatality reviews confirmed it, and policymakers acted upon that, recognizing strangulation as a distinct felony offense in 2023. This is what it looks like when the ecosystem is working with and for survivors. We create pathways for justice and ultimately life-saving change. Because when we get it right, lives are saved. But when we get it wrong, consequences are irreversible.
Thank you, Alicia, for those powerful words and for reminding us how important it is for us to stay connected. There's so much intentionality around those complex systems to keep them going and supporting one another. Chief Pickett, Alicia mentioned a crime statistic of a 37% increase in domestic violence in Ohio. And again, while violent crime is declining in many places, you've shared yourself that your officers are seeing an increase in domestic violence incidents in Birmingham, and you're prioritizing attention to that issue. What domestic violence trends are you seeing in Birmingham that concern you right now?
So yes, ma'am. So in 2024 in Birmingham, we experienced our most deadly year ever in our history. But we were able to make significant progress in reducing our crime by 45% in 2025. However, what's remained is a glaring evidence that domestic violence is still remaining a major issue. So while we focused on the intentionality of targeted enforcement and things of that nature as it relates to our homicides, we improved our clearance rate as it relates to our homicide investigation cases to prevent retaliation, to prevent reoffending. We noticed that domestic violence is still remaining a large issue in our community as it relates to driving the violent crime. Now, one of the issues is that, quite frankly, as police, we cannot police someone's living room. We can't be in the homes. So it's really important that, essentially we have some type of resources to address that issue, because as police, we just can't be in the homes. And that's where most domestic violence situations take place, is inside our residences.
Thank you. So how are you raising awareness about the issue in Birmingham? What can a police department do to try to reduce these trends and reduce domestic violence?
So we try to use a comprehensive approach. One of the things that I noticed last year when we try to analyze our data, And in analyzing it, we noticed last year, I'll say in the fourth quarter of last year, I noticed that it was about 7 or 8 homicides that were domestic violence related. So that being said, this year I wanted to focus on domestic violence. So one of the things that we did was I called a meeting with our city attorney's office, our district attorney's office, One Place, which is a center locally in Birmingham that works with victims of domestic violence, our U.S. Attorney's Office. So we brought the group together, met at the police headquarters, and we talked about what can we do from the enforcement end to help streamline things, and also how can we communicate, because a lot of times the law enforcement, we're the first persons on the scene. If it's not the paramedics or the fire department, we're the first person on the scene responding to a domestic violence call. So how can we, as first responders, get them the resources that they need immediately, and also in a discreet manner? Because sometimes people are in situations to where if you hand them a pamphlet that's got some type of resources with, domestic violence number or a number to call or legal resources, the offender might see that, the abuser might see that, and it may create a more volatile situation later on. So one of the things that we're trying to do in Birmingham is we redesigned our case cards that we issue for reports.
Yes.
And we just want to implement a code or something on there, or just different avenues of ways to reach out and get information and resources to those individuals in a discreet manner. And also having our officers be more aware and better trained on what the resources are to be able to get to the victims of these occurrences of domestic violence.
Thank you, Chief Pickett. Tom, when survivors come to a legal aid organization, what kinds of legal issues are they facing?
Thank you, Betran. Survivors of domestic violence come to legal aid organizations needing help to find safety, stability in their housing, finances, access to education, health care, fair determinations of child custody, and much more. All these problems have civil legal aid solutions that protect victims, help them stabilize their lives, and prevent the risk of suffering violence again in the future. In Maine, a protection from abuse order is the primary civil process available for victims, and it limits or prohibits contact by the abuser, can include other individualized relief, and it can be enforced by law enforcement. One study found that having a permanent protective order in place was associated with an 80% reduction in police-reported physical violence within the next year. Because court-appointed attorneys are not provided for civil legal needs, people with low income can only access these essential protections through nonprofit legal service providers like Pine Tree Legal and the other grantees of Legal Services Corporation around the country. According to one study, 83% of victims represented by an attorney successfully obtain protective orders, whereas just 32% of victims who proceed without counsel succeed. And as Senator Sullivan noted, research further indicates that the public service that most significantly reduces the long-term risk of domestic abuse is victims' access to legal aid. Pine Tree Legal Assistance also prioritizes holistic legal aid that addresses survivors' immediate safety needs as well as long-term recovery. 2/3 of our clients who receive protection from abuse help also receive services from us in one or more additional areas of civil legal need. These include efforts to stabilize clients' financial security, housing, and education. I'm going to briefly highlight. So because of our many years of work with survivors, we have expertise identifying civil legal protections that support or strengthen survivors' financial stability. And these include financial compensation for damage to property or our client through the protective order process, but also employment protections if, for example, survivors suffered sexual assault by coworkers, unemployment compensation for survivors who had to flee their job in order to escape sexual assault, resolution of IRS or consumer problems caused by behavior by the offender. And according to the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, survivors of domestic violence in Maine identified debt as one of the most urgently pressing problems that they face right after leaving an abusive relationship. So we use in collaboration with our Consumer Protection Unit, national model approaches with our local council to alleviate issues with third-party debt, auto loans, student loans, and utility debt. We also provide survivors with legal assistance on housing issues, including eviction and access to public housing, foreclosure defense, and other issues. And survivors who are students, we know face long-term economic damage if they're unable to complete educational programs as a result of sexual assault or domestic violence. And so we advocate for survivors sometimes in school disciplinary proceedings to use other tools to help them continue and complete education.
I mean, it underscores how at each stage, Tom, I mentioned earlier, each stage in life, age doesn't, it can touch your lives, and you will see survivors at different stages. When you're talking about schools, folks who are looking at trying to find their own housing for the first time, you're underscoring a point that I think is important to make, it how it spans across and touches so many lives at different stages.
That's right. One client story I'd like to highlight that helps illustrate several of these themes coming together is a client of ours named Celia, who's given permission for us to share her story. On a cold December night, Celia was assaulted and locked out of her house by her then boyfriend. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. After the assault, she noticed that the baby wasn't moving as much as normal. When her daughter was born, she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy and a heart condition that made her medically very fragile. Celia's relationship ended, and she began raising her daughter with almost no involvement from her ex. An advocate at Through These Doors, the local domestic violence resource center, referred Celia to Pine Tree Legal Assistance so that she would not have to navigate the complex legal process alone. Maris Hubbard, an attorney with our Family Law and Victim Rights Unit, represented Celia in her case. And although Celia's ex was uncooperative throughout the process and created significant barriers along the way, including trying to terminate his own parental rights to avoid child support, our attorney, Maris, was creative and zealous in her advocacy, and after the final hearing, the magistrate awarded Celia sole parental rights and responsibilities, granted her request to change their daughter's last name to match her own, established an ongoing child support order and ordered her ex to pay more than $17,000 in child support arrears. That has enabled Celia and her daughter to move out and into their own apartment, and for Celia to begin studying to become an EMT herself, pursue her passion for photography, and help her daughter find a safe and stable life. Her daughter is now walking and talking.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for sharing that. Tom, I want to ask you a quick follow-up question building on something that Senator Sullivan said. He talked about the rate of domestic violence homicides in Alaska, and I can't help but make the connection with Alaska and Maine, which is a very rural state. So you're talking vast areas, limited access to services, transportation barriers, no broadband. These create more isolation for those experiencing domestic violence. What challenges do rural survivors in particular face when legal help is far away or difficult to access?
Even with our team's massive effort, like for example, just in 2025, we handled over 1,300 domestic violence cases. There's still a massive unmet need statewide. In Maine, 89% of parties in protection from abuse cases proceed without counsel. And in our most rural counties, like Aroostook, Piscataquis, and Washington counties, 95 to 96% of parties in protective order cases are unrepresented. And we know of cases of survivors who filed a petition for protection from abuse on their own and withdrew it because they thought that they had no chance at all because their ex was using the family finances to hire a lawyer for himself, and she couldn't find a legal aid lawyer if we weren't available. One of the ways we maximize our impact in rural areas is we partner closely with Maine's domestic violence resource centers, part of the network similar to Alicia and her colleagues' network in Ohio. Right. And they provide referrals to us for clients who would most benefit from legal aid. And then we conduct an initial intake, meet with the client, and provide legal representation to resolve cases through negotiation or litigation in court. Is there time to share one more client story that illustrates?
I was going to ask if you can do that as your final point
We'll
while
do
I
that.
wrap up.
Okay.
I did want to ask, and I hope you will share it, Tom. I'd like to close by asking each of our panelists one question. If there's one thing people here today, especially policymakers, community leaders, should understand about the role that legal services can play in supporting survivors of domestic violence, what you can do, what would that be? I'll start again with you, Alicia.
If there is one thing to understand, it is this. Legal services is not an add-on service. It is a lifeline for domestic violence survivors. For survivors, legal advocacy is often the difference between continued harm and real safety. It is how someone secures a protection order, maintains custody over their children, stabilizes their housing, and begins to rebuild their lives. From a state coalition perspective, when legal aid is able to represent survivors, outcomes improve. When they're not able to, survivors fall through the cracks. If we are real serious about safety, legal services must be funded, it must be protected, and part of an essential part of the response.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you. Chief Pickett, I'll turn to you. I'll turn to you with the same question. What is the one thing people here today should understand about the role that legal services and you can play in supporting survivors of domestic violence?
Well, what's really important from the law enforcement perspective is that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. We just can't. So there needs to be continued support in this space. In our conversations with our local Victims Advocate Resource Center, One Place in Birmingham, Alabama, as Ms. Williamson spoke about earlier, as strangulation being an indicator, I learned in the meeting that we had earlier this year that it's 700, a victim is 700 times more likely, 700% more likely to be a victim of a fatal incident if they're a victim of strangulation, of DV strangulation. So in an effort of solving violent crime, and I know we can say that we know violent crime is an issue in America, correct? Well, the biggest, like she stated, the biggest indicator, and we track the most violent offenders, all types of murderers, robbers, things of that nature. Typically, those guys have and women sometimes, they have a history, somewhere in their history, of domestic violence. They've been abusive to their partner, they've strangled their partner before they decide to pull a trigger or pick up a gun or pick up some other weapon. I'll say that it's important that we have resources in this space because people leave for various different reasons. For men, they may not want to leave, or men or women, but some men don't want to leave because they fear they will not have access to their children. And they don't want to leave the situation because they fear that they may not see their kids. Women oftentimes fear that they might not have the financial backing and the resources, as Tom spoke about earlier, and it's going to be a huge strain on them. So without them feeling supported in various spaces, not just financially, for housing, for legal services, things of that nature, they will end up staying in a situation that could end up fatal. And that's the thing that we don't want to see in law enforcement. I will share a brief story. There was an indictment in Birmingham earlier this week, actually, and it was a case that stood out to me. It happened on Easter Sunday of last year, where there was a young lady that used her vehicle to run over her partner with their daughter in the back seat. And then there's another child on the porch. So she was just indicted, but that's a situation. I don't know what the complete history was in that relationship, but I would imagine, maybe there was some volatility there. If they knew the resources, they could have gotten counseling and could have gotten help. Maybe, I don't know if he didn't want to leave. I don't know if she was also a victim of domestic violence, but that family clearly needed resources. So now we have several children that don't have a mom because she's going to prison if she's convicted. We have a father that's gone. Rest in peace to him and his family. So now we don't want to create a cycle where those kids, they're going to end up being a product of their environment. They're going to end up repeating the cycle. So it's just imperative that the kids have the support, the victims have the support, so we don't continue to see a cycle of domestic violence taking people from their loved ones.
Chief Pickett, I want to thank you for using your platform to provide the convening power in Birmingham to bring the community together and the stakeholders to talk about the issue, and I appreciate you sharing that. Tom, I'm going to let you finish it off as our legal aid representative to share your final point.
Thanks, Mitrang. I'm going to share one more client story to help illustrate our rural services in particular. A client of ours named Cheryl, who gave permission to talk about her case, is from Aroostook County, which is by land area the largest county in any state east of the Mississippi River. The largest town in Aroostook has less than 9,000 people. And there are very few attorneys of any kind, legal aid or otherwise. So Cheryl was in a serious car accident and suffered a traumatic brain injury. And after the accident, her husband prevented her from going anywhere or talking to anyone, and he kept her secluded, told her her condition embarrassed him, called her derogatory names, and threatened to have her committed. The day after Christmas, Cheryl was knocked unconscious and seriously hurt. She had no memory of the incident, but her husband said she had fallen and hit her head on the tub, but he did not call an ambulance or bring her to the hospital. A week later, on her birthday, he started a fight with her, and she called the police, but he threatened to have her committed. She got scared and did not follow through with the police report. But then later on in January, she walked into our office, a small storefront on Main Street in Presque Isle, and said she wanted to talk about getting help dealing with her landlord. But while she was doing the intake with our paralegals, she disclosed that she was afraid of her husband. And as the story came out, we realized what she needed for protection, and an attorney named Lisa helped her file for and win a protection from abuse order that included ultimately an agreement with a firearms prohibition, authority for her to stay in the home and keep the car, protection of the pet, and spousal support for Cheryl. After the PFA was finalized, she changed the locks and reported that she felt empowered by standing up for herself. And through the course of accessing legal aid, she's gone from fearing for her life when she walked in the door of our office to having safety and stability going forward.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for leaving us on that note of hope and appreciation for the trauma-informed and survivor-centered ways that all of you are looking to support the network and be a part of the solution for survivors. I want to thank you, Alicia, Tom, Chief Pickett, for joining us today. On behalf of the Legal Services Corporation, I want to thank each of you and your teams and the networks that you are a part of for the work that you do every day to support and protect domestic violence survivors. Thank you. As I mentioned before, we have resources available. As I mentioned before, there's resources available at the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Please find our team members if you'd like to speak and learn more.